Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Stacker Chat. My name is Gina Abrams. I'm an employee with the Stacks project, and I'm joined by Stacks founder, Muneeb Ali. Thanks for being here, Muneeb.
Awesome to be here.
Awesome. Cool. So if you're new here, the Stacks 2.0 blockchain launched earlier this year, bringing apps and smart contracts to Bitcoin. And in this week's Stacker Chat, we wanted to cover a couple community questions, but we also recently saw a blog post that covered what the Stacks blockchain is, especially in comparison to some of the different mental models that folks have. I think a lot of questions typically come up because the Stacks blockchain has a fully new consensus mechanism that connects the Stacks blockchain to the Bitcoin blockchain. So Muneeb, would you be able to share some of the highlights from that blog post? And this was also written by Jude Nelson of the Stacks Foundation. He's a Stacks core developer. We'll link it out in the description below. But yeah, at a high level, would love to hear your thoughts on what stood out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was a really good post by Jude. For people who don't know who Jude is, he's also a computer scientist from Princeton. I actually worked with him even before the Stacks project at the computer science department. We were hacking on scalable decentralized storage systems together right before the Stacks project started. And he's amazing. He's a hardcore engineer. I think if you just look at his GitHub contributions to the project, you can actually get a sense of what I'm talking about. So this post, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you should go and read the post, because Stacks consensus is new and in many ways like radically different from the kind of things people might be used to. And I think because it doesn't cleanly fit into an existing box, a lot of people actually confuse it. And we've seen that confusion from a lot of different camps, like even some other projects in Bitcoin, they were trying to draw comparisons to Stacks and actually got a lot of stuff wrong. Similarly, other ecosystems like Ethereum and others, they were actually trying to compare Stacks and again, got a lot of stuff wrong. So I think it's partly motivated by helping educate people, helping them to think about what Stacks is and also like what it's clearly not, right? So I'll try to summarize the post, but all the details are really there. So the first thing is that Stacks is actually not a proof of stake system, right? So Ethereum is trying to shift to proof of stake. There are a lot of proof of stake systems out there. I would actually say that proof of stake is at this point a very well-studied area within crypto, because there are so many projects that are basically doing proof of stake, right? So it's a more understood type of a concept. And Stacks is definitely not proof of stake because the token holders, they're not putting up any capital at stake. Like you cannot be slashed. The consensus mechanism works very differently. And the reason that why we did that, I think it's important to understand the reason here. The reason is that me plus other kind of like designers of the Stacks blockchain actually really value the property of independent verification. Independent verification is a property that Bitcoin has. For example, if anyone gave you 2 different copies of the Bitcoin blockchain, you can independently verify without talking to anyone on the planet. You can independently verify that one fork is the correct one over the other, because one fork would actually have more compute power on it, and you can independently verify that. And that's a very, very nice property to have. And we wanted to maintain that property for Stacks as well, right? So if anybody gives you a copy of the Stacks history, you'll require the version of the Bitcoin blockchain as well, but you can independently verify by looking at the history that which is the correct version. And I think that is a very nice property to have for blockchains, because I think a lot of people, they kind of like try to focus on, for example, the speed of a blockchain. And they forget that it's always possible to make a blockchain go faster by relaxing some of these properties, right? If you make it a little less decentralized, if you basically forego independent verification you can turn these knobs and actually make these systems go faster. And some of the areas that I'm researching personally these days is how to potentially introduce that type of capability in our ecosystem as well, where we very explicitly can actually trade off some of these things. But at the base layer, at the foundation layer, I'm of the opinion that you have to optimize for decentralization, you have to optimize for independent verification. So Stacks actually kind of like maintains that property. There are other differences with proof of stake as well, but again, you should go and read the post to understand how it's clearly not a proof of stake system. Then some people tend to think of Stacks as a Bitcoin sidechain. Even though Stacks has a connection to Bitcoin, it is certainly not a Bitcoin sidechain. Stacks actually has its own security budget. So this is where we need to kind of like understand some of the inner workings of what we have done with Stacks. So basically, what we have done is the core of the idea is that the Bitcoin miners have already spent energy and electricity to produce Bitcoin. How can we have a proof of work-like system? So our motivation here is to have a proof of work-like system without having the additional consumption of energy, right? So we don't want people to consume more electricity, and we want to reuse the energy that has already been used with Bitcoin. So what we've really done is that like Stacks actually connects to the Bitcoin chain, and you can actually have almost like a settlement of Stacks history is stored literally on the Bitcoin chain, right? So if you look at the history of kind of like all history of Stacks, like basically all forks of or potential forks of the Stacks blockchain, that history is preserved in the Bitcoin blockchain itself, right? So which is a very interesting property, which means that if someone wants to completely rewrite the history of Stacks, they would also have to rewrite the history of Bitcoin, right? That is not the case with proof of stake. If somebody takes over a proof of stake network, they can actually produce as many different histories of the blockchain as they want to, right? And there's no one stopping them from doing that. But you cannot do that with Stacks, because to rewrite history of Stacks, you will also need to rewrite history of Bitcoin, which is extremely hard to do. The second thing that it does is it has this very interesting property where it makes certain types of attacks on the Stacks chain public by default. Like, because the attacker would need to kind of like announce these attacks on the Bitcoin side, this is just how the protocol works, that the attacker cannot actually build a private fork of Stacks, right? So this is a really interesting property, because what that really means is, technically, if you try to build a private fork of Stacks, you also need to effectively have the ability to reorg Bitcoin, which is again extremely hard to do, right? So that's where the security of Bitcoin plays a role. That the history of the Stack side is linked with the history of Bitcoin, and it makes attacking the Stacks blockchain by default a public thing. So what happens when you make that a public thing? Let's say there's a malicious party and wants to attack the Stacks chain. Because the attack is now public and there is almost like a slow start, like an inherent slow start to these attacks, it gives people a time to react. In other words, it makes the cost of attack actually dynamic, right? Because the people who care about the Stacks ecosystem, other than the normal kind of like security budget that is ongoing because of the Stacks miners and the amount of Bitcoin that they're spending, because it makes these things dynamic, you can actually make practical attacks much harder to pull off, because any of the parties that have a vested interest in kind of like maintaining the Stacks blockchain can step in and make the attack dynamically harder for the attacker. So the attacker is just losing money and is not able to kind of like pull off the attack, which is again a very different and very new and very interesting property to have from a Stack side. And I know that there's a lot of discussion around Bitcoin's energy use and this and that, and that's very interesting to note. that the way Stacks kind of like reuses Bitcoin's energy. Yes, there are some transactions that happen on the Bitcoin side. So the Stacks miners are actually sending Bitcoin transactions and they're paying fairly high fees to Bitcoin miners. But those transactions are fairly minimal depending on the actual traffic on the Stack side, right? Because like a bunch of the transactions on the Stack side, they're basically they're getting settled as a hash. And a bunch of miners are just announcing those hashes on the Bitcoin side. So there are fairly limited number of transactions that happen on the Bitcoin side. Any quote unquote energy footprint of those transactions is very small, but that brings scalability or energy efficiency to the system because new use cases like the .BTC domain or these NFTs or new type of liquidity protocols, they're actually happening on the Stack side. They benefit from the security of Bitcoin, but you're not doing any additional proof of work, which is a really important property, I think, because what that means is that instead of starting separate blockchains, people can use Bitcoin as a secure base layer and do settlements on Bitcoin. And without introducing more kind of like proof of work type energy, they can actually use Bitcoin itself, Bitcoin, the crypto asset itself, to secure new use cases and new blockchains, and which interestingly was the original vision that Satoshi Nakamoto talked about back in 2010 when they were talking about additional use cases as like BitDNS that eventually became Namecoin and so on. The core idea that Satoshi had was how can you have these use cases that can be their own separate chains, but they can actually share the compute power of Bitcoin, because then that aligns incentives as well. So the Stacks community has incentive alignment with the Bitcoin community, and actually there's a huge overlap between the two. There are many people who are Bitcoiners and who are excited about the use cases that Stacks has, and vice versa, because there is a common thing in the middle, the security of the Bitcoin blockchain that all of us care about, and we are directly kind of like depending on the security of the blockchain. Of the Bitcoin blockchain for a thriving Stacks ecosystem. Again, coming back to the differences, this is not how sidechains work. Like sidechains are very different. They don't have their own asset, so they don't have their own security budget. You're effectively kind of like building a very different type of a system. And again, I would ask people to go and look at the details in the blog post to like understand all the differences. Same with merge mining. This is not a merge mining chain. In merge mining, a subset of the Bitcoin miners are also trying to participate on the merge mine chain. And in general, it's generally very hard to get a very high percent of those Bitcoin miners to care about the merge mine chain. In the Stacks case, the Bitcoin miners are agnostic to what's happening on the Stacks side. Right? They're just processing normal Bitcoin transactions. There's no modification needed. There's no buy-in needed from the Bitcoin miners. And that's how we design Stacks, that it can basically require no modification from Bitcoin. And yet you can just launch it, you can just run it, and it's permissionless. Anyone can come in and anyone can become a miner on the system, which is a really nice property to have. And finally, Stacks is also not a L2 system. I know many people that, think of it as a Bitcoin L2. It's actually not, because L2s are strictly defined in a different way. Especially like, if you look at Bitcoin, Lightning would be a better example of an L2-like system that will clearly come and settle on Bitcoin. Or in terms of Ethereum, I think there are some L2 protocols coming where basically the design is extremely different, right? Like you're effectively relying on the L1 blockchain for the security of the L2 layer, right? And over here, this is a very different model. At best it's a hybrid model, but Stacks clearly has its own security budget, right? And the security budget of Stacks is actually tied to the Stacks asset, which is used as gas for smart contracts there. And it is not dependent on an external source, even though if you dig into the details, there is this interesting link between the security of Bitcoin and the security of Stacks. But at a high level, the fact to know is that Stacks has its own security budget that is defined by the Stacks asset. And I think that's kind of like the difference. Again, go check out the blog post. It has all the details. It even has a very helpful chart where you can see all the differences for how L2s are different from merge mining, from side chains, from kind of like the stacks consensus. And the best way, I think, at a high level to remember what type of blockchain is stacks. Interestingly, it's actually a L1 blockchain. And it is a special type of an L1 blockchain that actually connects with Bitcoin. And interestingly, through this consensus between Bitcoin and the Stacks L1 layer, there's some new types of properties that weren't possible with just separate kind of like proof of work type L1 or a separate proof of stake type L1. So it's a new type of a L1 blockchain that kind of like shares certain security properties due to its unique connection with Bitcoin. I think that's the best way to understand what Stacks is.
Absolutely. A lot for folks to dig into there. Now, one thing that comes up a lot, I think a lot of us who are here are Bitcoiners, and we understand the power that Bitcoin has. But I am curious if you can expand a little bit on just sort of the bet on Bitcoin and why this is considered, the most secure blockchain, and why Stacks chose to build on Bitcoin.
Yes, so I think that that's a great question, and that's kind of like the trillion-dollar question, right? There's so much kind of like speculation or arguments about, hey, is it going to be Bitcoin? Is it going to be Ethereum or some other L1 protocol? And we're clearly in the camp of Bitcoin, and the reason there is that Bitcoin maximizes for decentralization and durability. So it's actually relatively a simple base layer compared to some of the more fully featured base layers like Ethereum and others. But that also means that it's very, very hard to change Bitcoin, both because of how it's designed, the kind of like the values of the project and the community that sprung around it. Like, if I think that 10 years from now, is Bitcoin going to be more or less the same thing that it is today? The answer is yes. And it's actually a good thing. That's the part that a lot of people don't understand, like, because they think that to be competitive, you have to be like constantly upgrading the blockchain and adding new features, and like pretty much like what's happening with Ethereum, right? Like, they're changing the monetary policy, they're changing the consensus mechanism and switching to proof of stake and so on for an asset that is basically the reserve cryptocurrency or a store of value. I think those are actually bad properties. You don't want the monetary policy to change. You don't want the consensus protocol to change. You actually want stability. You want that thing to just be reliable and be simple. So because it has a very small attack vector, so you can trust it, right? That there's not going to be some sort of a catastrophic bug at the base layer, because that would have consequences for everything else that is depending on that base layer. So that's why we chose Bitcoin, because it's durable, it's simple, and it will likely remain kind of like what it is. And those are the type of properties we want, because we can do the experimentation on the stack side. We can actually be more innovative on the stack side without putting the Bitcoin layer at risk, right? And I think that's the division in a two-layer solution, where you can explicitly have smart contracts in a separate layer that can be more experimental, and you can have the more stable store of value layer, the more stable settlement layer as the Bitcoin layer.
Awesome. Now, on that note, a lot of folks are very interested in just upcoming developments for the Stacks project and developer tools. What are you excited for on the roadmap ahead?
Yeah, so speaking of the roadmap, I think a bunch of different entities have started putting together a roadmap. I'm trying to give some input as well. I think given the decentralization or true decentralization, given there's so many entities and no kind of like single company that is responsible for this project, it's hard to have things like roadmaps, right? But I think there's a community effort, and different entities like the Stacks Foundation, they're trying to put together this effort. I'll try to contribute to that as well. But in terms of what I'm excited about, I definitely think that microblocks, like the proper launch of microblocks, that would make transactions much faster. On the stack side, I'm super excited about that when people can actually experience much faster transactions when they're using the Explorer or the wallet and so on. That'd be amazing. There are certain almost like mini R&D projects. One is around Clarity features. So Clarity can right now basically react to Bitcoin transactions, but we would love to have Clarity directly write Bitcoin transactions in one way or the other. There are a bunch of different ways that we are exploring that. I think that would be a superpower because that completes the loop. Like there are many things you can already do just because Clarity can react to Bitcoin transactions, but the other way around would be closing that loop. And I think that's something I'm very excited about. There are certain things that I'm working on, like more as R&D personal hobby things that I've started sharing with a few other computer scientists and the Stack community. And those are basically ideas around, okay, if you have the stable, decentralized permissionless base layer, like Bitcoin and Stacks, can you then add additional features like potential subnets that are faster and they trade off certain things? Because I think you can always go the other way around. If you start from a decentralized base, you can always turn the knobs and make these trade-offs, but not vice versa. If you start with, let's say, a fully centralized or federated system, you cannot build a decentralized system on top of it, right? So I'm very excited about that general area, that now that, building the decentralized base and a truly permissionless type of a blockchain is the hard thing to do. Once you do that, and you want certain properties like, much faster transactions or other types of subnets with different properties, those are relatively easier to add on top. And I'm pretty interested about that. And finally, I think there are 25 startups that are going through the Stacks accelerator right now. This is just the accelerator. There are people who are building outside of the accelerator as well. And I think over the coming months, so 4 or 5 months ago, the Stacks blockchain launched and we got Clarity contracts, we got the stacking functionality. And I think these startups are basically the next level. So that's the thing that I'm the most excited about, that when people start launching these use cases, it will certainly go from not just that we have this amazing infrastructure and programming language. Now we have real kind of like teams and startups that have built interesting things that everyone can use. And I think that's truly the next level that I'm excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to meet a couple of the founders in Miami not too long ago, and just brilliant people who are working on some really exciting projects. So I can't wait for more details to be shared there. On that note, though, I'm curious about what are some of the interesting or unexpected use cases for either Stacks or Clarity smart contracts deployed on Stacks that you've either come across or hearing about?
Yeah, I think people have started doing interesting things and unexpected things already. Like, for example, the Boom team, they made these Boom boxes, which are these NFTs that can get a Bitcoin yield on it. That was pretty innovative. Or I think Freehold or Patrick, I think they've been looking into these ideas of city coins. I think in Miami, they were talking about the mayor was actually tweeting about the idea of a Miami coin. And I think there are very interesting relationship with how Stacks works, especially the Bitcoin yield component, where you can potentially have these treasuries for different cities that have a Bitcoin yield attached to it. And I think that's a very unique property of the Stacks blockchain. And obviously, when we were working on this, we never thought that a mayor of a city would be interested in having a Bitcoin yielding treasury for that city. And obviously, that's a very unexpected, but really, really exciting use case.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thanks so much, Muneeb. That's going to be a wrap for this week. But everyone, please subscribe to the Stacks YouTube channel, where you're going to be able to find more sessions of Stacker Chats. And if you'd like to learn more about Stacks, head over to stacks.co. There's a bunch of resources there. Definitely join our Discord, because that's where a lot of the action is happening. And you can stay posted on some of these teams and projects that are launching. And we're gonna tune back in next week. So definitely feel free to reach out to us if there's anything you'd like to see covered in future sessions here. And definitely check out the info area to read Jude's blog post and for any other information. But thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.